Now, the sixth session of the United Nations Environment Assembly is underway in Nairobi, Kenya. This with the body taking a keen interest in solving the East African nation's climate crisis, which weighs heavily on its economy, which is driven by tourism and agriculture. Now, multilateralism is suggested as the key tool to help achieving this. And Karin Boomsma, who's a project director for sustainable inclusive business for the Kenya Private Sector Association, joins us with more insights. Karin, thank you for your time and a good afternoon to you.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Karin, maybe you can start off by actually helping us understand what we mean by a climate crisis within Kenya.
So we actually should look at it a little bit broader. So we talk about climate change, nature and biodiversity loss, pollution and waste, and they're all interconnected. And I think that is also a thematic focus for the UNEA this year, that we realize that we don't talk about those issues in isolation. They're all interconnected.
What has that been like, practically on the ground when we speak of the issues of the loss, the nature and biodiversity loss, of pollution, Karin? What does it look like for the ordinary Kenyan, and maybe the impact that has had on the economy?
Thank you. Yes, so indeed, we still face a lot of floods and droughts in our country, actually on an annual basis, and it becomes more and more irregular. So we see a lot of weather patterns really shifting. They're unpredictable, and they're very erratic as well. So we can really have a drought one month, and the next month there's already a flood. And obviously the areas that are most affected are the arid areas, but also where the community and where local communities operate, because they don't have the funds actually to make the changes. What we're talking about a lot is mitigation of climate change and adaptation. And we see a lot of focus also in accessing finance to say, okay, let's adapt and look at the situation, how can we deal with it, but not really investing in mitigation. So, and that is really for the people on the ground, an issue. So where you see, for instance, Maasai local communities that are not in the tourist area, so they don't have the income from the tourists, because those are protected conservation areas. That is well maintained, that's controlled. But if we look at the areas where there's no tourism, it's actually an issue, because there is no water access, and there is no way that you actually can start with smart agriculture if you do not have the basic resources like water available. So I think we really need to look at how we can invest in those kind of solutions in order for the local communities to practice smart agriculture.
I must also then ask you about what we're seeing here with the United Nations Environment Assembly underway in Kenya, Karin, and what the Kenyan private and public sector will be presenting, to, of course, maybe address the issue of funding as you painted.
Yeah, so they need to look at it from a very collaborative way. And that's another focus of the UNEA this year. What we really recognize is the multilateral conversations and partnerships. And they are essential, because climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss, it's not a country-specific issue. It crosses borders. And the impact of someone's action somewhere else in the north can impact actually in Africa. So we really need to look at who is responsible for what. By now, we know all about climate change, and we actually have the facts. We just need to put our responsibilities together and make that count, and do not negotiate without boundaries, I would say. So, for instance, the UN Global Treaty on Plastic Pollution is a great example that was signed off 2 years ago, but we now need to action it. There are still countries that really are not ambitious on this topic, and yet they've signed, and therefore they delay the process. And I would call that corruption as well, because you're corrupting other countries. And Kenya is very ambitious and very advanced. We have a lot of great policies in place. So the government might not have so much money, but we do have actually a willing and very keen government that is keen on a great and healthy environment and has amazing policies in place that really support the private sector to implement the right nature-based solutions for our issues. But we need to support from other partners as well. You can't do that on your own. And what we see in Kenya is that those partnerships work really well because we all have different stakes, but we have the same vision. And that's what we need to work with ultimately. But everyone needs to play their role. So we shouldn't have delays from other parts of the world.
I got you. And I'm also keen just to get your thoughts on the issue of the funding that's necessary here. You're saying that, of course, you know, these mitigation and adaptation strategies really need more funding. But of course, a big conversation on the African continent is, and it's controversial, I guess, Karin, is the issue of getting into debt. Countries like Kenya, which emits less than 0.1% of global greenhouse emissions, getting into debt to be able to respond to climate change. It really is a bit of a tricky one. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, we definitely need to make sure that funds are being distributed, but actually fairly, and what is fair. And I would say there's a much bigger need to look into that and to do that right, because the impact from abroad onto our climate change, for instance, is what you say. It's massive, but our contribution to it is very minimal. Kenya, for instance, has 90% renewable energy sources. So, you know, look at other countries around, not only in South Africa, but also in the West, where that is far from the case. And we're quite ahead with those kind of things. But still, we do not have the funds to implement and to really solve all those issues on the ground. As we said, like we see, there's a high resilience with the export industry, for instance. So agricultural export companies, as well as, for instance, the high-end tourism, those companies and that industry is ahead with the innovations. They know how to preserve their businesses. They are already much smarter with how they use, for instance, organic pesticides. They are doing very smart irrigations. They have everything in place because in the first place they had the resources to do so. The fact is now that we need to make sure that everyone, also the low-income population, the small businesses, the startups and new initiatives and local communities can tap into funds that are actually required to do the same.
Well, Karin, I hope we can chat again at the end of the UNEA and get all the outcomes there. Thank you for your time today. That was Karin Boomsma. She is Project Director for Sustainable Inclusive Business for the Kenya Private Sector Association.